Good morning. Alright, magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Puwede na siguro tayong magsimula, 10:00 na 'no. Dapat maaga ako kaso, meron din palang nawawala sa Zoom room, parang sa totoong buhay lang 'no. Mali yung na-click ko na link at nasa ibang room ako. Anyway, ipagpapatuloy natin yung ating pag-aaral nung nakaraang linggo. Meron akong tina-try today, magle-lecture ako ng nakatayo. Kaya, ah, ang, location ng ating lecture ngayon sa ibang bahagi naman ng bahay ko. Kasi sumasakit na yung likod ko dahil maghapon akong nagtuturo ng nakaupo. So, tingnan natin kung mag-work ito. Not sure, medyo kakaiba yung, feel ng nagtuturo ng nakatayo. Okay, anyway, having said that, tutuloy natin ano. So, exciting na yung pinag-aaralan natin sa ngayon 'no, kasi umpisahan na nating pag-aralan yung mga detalye o yung mga konsepto siguro na mas familiar sa inyo bilang isang layperson or sa lay people in general 'no. Ito yung demand and supply. Yung pag-aaral natin sa introduction to sa economics is something it's more that information is more, I guess, more nuanced, more confined to people that actually study economics. But from here on, we're going to be talking about uh, the the most common of all, the most common concepts among all of the economic concepts, which is demand and supply. And then we're going to concentrate or focus more on just one particular agent who is the consumer, no? And then that will be the coverage of your first exam. Your exam is next week, FYI. Next, not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday after next. That's the 12th, I think. Okay, so pagpapatuloy na natin, no, nasa chapter 3 na tayo. Tutuloy natin, tatapusin natin yon, and then we'll proceed with chapter 4. Okay, so having said that, let me share screen. Share screen tayo. Okay, kung matatandaan nyo, ito yung ating huling tiningnan, no, yung demand schedule na graph. Okay, ano uli ang demand schedule? O ang graph na nagpapakita ng relationship between quantity and price and quantity demanded. Alright, so itong graph na to ay galing doon sa table na tiningnan natin nung nakaraang pagkikita natin nung Martes. Kung makikita nyo, ipa-plot lang natin yung mga data na yon mula sa table at mabubuo natin itong demand schedule na katulad ng ipinapakita dito sa screen ngayon. Okay, sandali lang. Alright, ngayon, the basic thing that you must remember about the demand schedule is that it was the basis for the law of downward sloping demand. No? So which means that as the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down and vice versa. And I think kung huli tayong nagkita, pinaalala ko din sa inyo, isipin ninyo, bakit kapag tumataas ang presyo ay bumababa ang demand. No? So maaaring sabihin ng iba, kasi mahal eh. Kasi nagmamahal nga, ibig sabihin hindi ko mas kaunti ang ma-afford ko. Alright, so meron kang constraint which is your income. Maaari din namang okay kapag tumataas yung presyo ng isang produkto, maaaring sabihin ko na wag na lang, iba na lang ang bibilin ko kasi mahal yun di ba? May tendency ka rin naman bilang isang mamimili na kapag tumataas ang presyo ng tumataas ang presyo ng butter, no? Tumataas ang presyo ng butter, hindi pala kayo namimili. Pero halimbawa lang, tumataas ang presyo ng butter, maaaring bumili kayo ng substitute na mas mura, di ba? So ngayon, ito ang pinaka basic na dahilan, nuance ng demand schedule, no? Bakit negatively sloping ang demand curve? Kasi kapag tumataas ang presyo, there is a tendency for the consumer to hold back, no, or maybe step back. Formally, itong dalawang depiction na ito, kung bakit bumababa ang demand kapag tumataas ang presyo ay nahahati sa dalawa. Tinatawag na substitution effect at saka income effect. No? So, pag sinabing substitution effect, ibig sabihin kapag you substitute, no? So in very simple terms, you substitute one good for another. Kasi kapag katulad nga nung sinabi ko, kapag tumataas ang presyo ng butter, then ang tendency ng mamimili ay palitan, no? Palitan ng mas mura. Bakit? Kasi there is a reason kung bakit gusto mo bumili ng produkto, di ba? Ang gusto mong mangyari, remember, may dahilan kung bakit ka bumibili ng mga bagay-bagay. Di ba? Isipin natin, step back ulit tayo. Bakit ka bumibili ng kahit na anong bagay? Kasi meron kang expectation na mas magiging masaya ka sa buhay kapag ka nabili mo kung anumang produkto yon. Di ba? Bawat kilos ng isang tao, ng isang agent, economic agent na tinatawag, ay may dahilan. Yun ang basis ng rationality ng isang nilalang. Bawat bagay na ginagawa natin, mayroong dahilan. Walang rational na agent, walang rational na tao na gumagawa ng isang bagay na makakasama sa kanya. Kasi ang pinakadahilan kung bakit tayo kumikilo sa bawat desisyong ginagawa natin, mayroon tayong pag-asa o expectation na yung desisyon na yon ay magpapaganda kung hindi man magpapataas ng antas ng ating kasayahan. Irrational yung kapag gumawa ka ng isang bagay tapos nagpapalungkot sa iyo, di ba? Kaya I just had a conversation with a friend about how she's taking steps, and which actually hurt her. And sabi ko sa kanya, irrational yan, isipin mong mabuti kung bakit. And then it turns out nga na may trauma siya sa buhay. That's why irrational yung choices. Kasi hindi rational yung gumagawa, kumikilos ka, you make choices that hurt you. Okay, so kapag meron kang gustong bilhin, gusto mo ng butter, ang expectation dun is kakain ka, mas magiging masaya ka kung merong palaman o merong butter yung tinapay. Ngayon, tumataas ang presyo ng butter. So maaaring mag-substitute ka. Imbis na butter, lagi, may bibili ka ng part butter and then part margarine. So, let's say kung kumukonsumo ka dati ng 50 grams ng butter, gagawin mo sigurong 30 grams of butter na lang at yung natitirang 20 grams ay papalitan mo ng margarine. May combination ka na ng goods. Pero dun sa decision mo yon, you can see that you substituted margarine for butter. And that's called the substitution effect. The other is what's called the income effect. This has to do with the feeling that as a result of the price increase, you feel poorer. Or as a result of the price decrease, you feel richer. So either way, it can go either way. So kaya bakit kapag tumaas ang presyo ng isang bagay, ng isang produkto na gusto mong bilhin, suddenly hindi ka bibili ng kasing dami ng noon kasi dahil sa pagtaas ng presyo na yon, yung purchasing power ng iyong allowance ay bumaba. So may income effect na tinatawag. So parang ang pakiwari mo, ikaw ay mas mahirap kaysa sa dati. And remember na ang purchases natin, later on I'll expand this to when I expand the demand function. That income determines our purchases. Obvious naman yon, di ba? Kapag mas mayaman ka, mas marami kang purchases. Kapag mas mahirap ka, mas konti ang purchases mo. Alright? Hindi lang in terms of range, iba-ibang klase ng goods, but also yung quantity of goods that you buy. So kalimbawang mas maliit ang allowance mo, ang allowance mo 100 pesos, nakakabili ka ng 5 banana Q, parang gutom na gutom ka halimbawa kasi. So kapag binawasan yung allowance mo to 50 pesos, babawasan mo din yung pagbili mo ng banana Q. Maaaring magtiis ka na lang. Alright? Yun yung tinatawag na income effect. Okay. So, there are two basic types of demand curves, katulad din naman sa supply curves. Yung tinatawag na individual demand curve versus the aggregate demand curve. Yung individual demand curve represents individual preferences. Kaya ang individual demand curve ay iba-iba. Kasi ang individual demand curve ni Jose ay iba sa demand curve ni Pepe, iba ang demand curve ni Pepe kay Pilar, etc. Kasi individual preferences ang reflected sa individual demand curve. Okay. tawid naman tayo doon sa tinatawag na aggregate demand curve. Dito naman sa aggregate demand curve, buong ekonomiya na to. So pinagsama-sama ang lahat ng individual preferences. Kaya bang pagsama-samahin ang lahat ng individual preferences? Oo naman, no? Yung data natin halimbawa, yung table na tiningnan natin nung nakaraan, di ba? May numbers yun eh. That could represent one person. And then the number of, or the set of numbers of another person can be contained in another table. So we can add them all up and create an aggregate table. And then if we plot that aggregate table, then you'll have your aggregate demand curve. Because remember that the demand curve comes from data. You know, the plot, the points that are on the demand curve, they all originate from set of information that we've collected and that represents the quantity demanded or the quantity purchased by people as different prices are reflected in the market. So so the individual demand curve could all be added up. So all the information in one of the different tables of preferences or the different tables of individual representing individual preferences, they could all be added up, and then you plot all of that information and you have your aggregate demand curve. Okay. Now, ordinarily, it is the aggregate demand curve that is observable because that's the one that government collects, that most data collection agencies collect. Individual preferences are plotted by individual people, but they're not necessarily studied by just they're not studied by government agents. And all the information are just collated and aggregated and then plotted. Okay. All right. So what are the determinants of demand? All right. So para mas madaling intindihin kayo, what will determine your demand? Well, this is expand lang natin kasi this determinants of aggregate demand. So although it can apply also to individual demand, kaya lang there are certain determinants that only apply to aggregate and not to individual. No? Average income is common to both aggregate and individual. No? Income will determine demand. So anong relationship between income and demand? Well, obvious naman, pag tumataas ang income, tataas ang demand, di ba? Pag bumababa ang income, tataas ang demand, whether it's aggregate or individual. Okay. Now, the second one is the size of the market. This is only for the aggregate. Kasi pag sinabing size of market, this has to do with population. So the more people there are, the more demand there is, because the aggregate demand is going to be more because you have more people represented in the information table, okay, which is the reason why some people say that the economy is growing and therefore this government is wonderful because the economy is growing. Not necessarily, just the fact that the population of the country is growing by 2% means that theoretically the country's demand or the country's economy is set to expand by at least 2%. Kasi nga the demand is going to grow because population increases. All right. So the size of the market isn't present in the determinant of the individual demand curve, but it is for the aggregate. Prices of related goods present for both, for both aggregate and individual. What are the related goods? Yung substitute is one. So if the price of margarine halimbawa declines, what do you think will happen to the demand for butter? Butter suddenly becomes more expensive in the minds of the consumers, as a result of the price of margarine, which is a substitute, as a result of that price going down. So the price of a substitute has a direct impact on the demand for a good, the substitute for that good. Now, what are the other potential goods that can affect the demand for one good? The other is what we call the complement. Dali lang ha. Sorry. Nahanap ko yung yon para I can write that down. So you have substitute goods and what we call complement goods. Ano example ng complement goods? Ito yung gatas at kape, gatas at kape, sapatos at medyas. Alright? In other words, if you consume goods in tandem or in pairs, halimbawa, the price of one good is going to affect the demand for the other good. For instance, if you can't drink coffee without milk, or if you can't drink coffee without sugar, and the price of sugar goes up, then the demand for coffee will naturally go down because now you can afford less sugar. If you can afford less sugar, then you won't buy as much coffee as before because you don't drink coffee without sugar. So they have to come in tandem. They have to be complements. No, that's the situation. So if the price of a complement good rises, the demand for the original good declines. If the price of the complement good declines, then the demand then there's a positive effect on the demand for the original good. Pero remember that ceteris paribus. Ibig sabihin, all other things being held constant. Because if the price of one complementary good, or the substitute good changes, but the average income also changed, then you can't make a conclusion. So you have to check first which has more impact, especially if the effect or the change in income at the change in the price of the substitute good are in opposite direction. Then you have to evaluate. You have to hold the other variables constant. Otherwise, you can't make a conclusion. Okay. All right. So what else? What else can affect the demand? Taste and preferences, both for individual as well as aggregate demand. So taste and preferences. So, and how are taste and preferences formed? Ay, maraming factors that affect taste and preferences. One is culture, one is education, one is gender, religion, sometimes advertisements. So kapag may mga influencers dyan, suddenly, di ka naman dati kumakain ng tinapay, biglang-bigla dahil may influencer kang sinusundan. Biglang, ay, hindi na ako kakain ng kanin kasi kanin is for losers. So kakain ka na lang ng tinapay ngayon. Then suddenly, your demand for bread rises. So maraming bagay and mahirap hulihin all of the factors that change taste and preferences, because there are many. But they're interesting to study. Quite interesting, actually, in terms of market analysis. Kasi it's quite interesting to see how people are affected by different variables. Sometimes, some people, for instance, I was basically a tea drinker, but because of I was traveling, I was working abroad, and I was in Europe for a while, and suddenly nag-change yung preference ko. Nagkakape na ako ngayon, bihira na ako mag-tsaa. Whereas before going abroad, I was really a tea drinker. Ngayon, coffee drinker na ako as a result. So different things can change your preferences. Season and other special influences such as location. Those are other factors that can affect your demand. So season, halimbawa, Christmas season. Pagka Christmas season or Valentine na lang, siguro kasi pinakamalapit. Pag Valentine season, there's an increased demand for flowers. Diba? Prior to Valentine's, the demand for flowers might be the regular demand, whatever, or just occasional if there's a birthday or not. But suddenly, because Valentine's is this huge holiday, ba tawag doon? In any case, it's a huge occasion, and to show your love, not just for your significant other, but perhaps towards family members such as your mother, your grandmother, whoever. So suddenly the demand for flowers rises as a result of the season, location as well. Kung napunta ka sa isang area wherein there coffee drinkers sila, and suddenly your demand for coffee rises. Okay? All right. Okay, now, ceteris paribus, ngayon pag-isapan natin, when does a demand curve shift? So, drawing natin ng konti para meron kayong reference. Price, quantity, demand is downward sloping, di ba? Okay. So, recall that in this graph, the only two variables that we're trying to put together, trying to match, are just price and quantity. quantity demanded. Excuse me. So here we see that as the price rises, quantity demanded declines. Price declines and quantity demanded rises. Ceteris paribus. Pag sinabing ceteris paribus, all of the determinants of demand that I showed you earlier, they're all being held constant. They're not allowed to change. So income isn't allowed to change. The price of complements or complement goods are not allowed to change. The price of substitute goods are not allowed to change. Tastes and preferences are not allowed to change, etc. But what if you allow any of those to change? Let's say there's a rise in income. Rise in income will then not just is a change in income isn't about price and quantity anymore. This is about the entire demand curve being redefined. Kasi meron kang may assumption ka ng income dito sa graph na to, halimbawa dito sa demand curve na to. Your income, which is, let's say, call it Y, income, let's say is equal to 100 pesos. This is an individual demand curve. What if your income now rose to 200 pesos? What will happen to your demand curve? Remember that the assumption for this downward sloping demand curve is 100 pesos. But now you're relaxing that and you're allowing it to change to 200 pesos. Then there's going to be a shift. There's a difference between a movement along the line versus a shift in the entire demand schedule. When it's just the change in price, that's a movement along the line. But when you change all of the other determinants that shape the demand curve or that define the demand curve or that determine the demand curve, then it's going to be a shift. So a rise in income is going to push the demand curve to the left or to the right, meaning there's going to be more demand, diba? As a result of higher income. Think about it, left or right, mag-shift yung demand curve, papunta ba doon or papunta sa kaliwa? Papunta sa kanan, papunta sa kaliwa? Answer? Kanan, exactly. Mag-shift siya pa kanan kasi tumaas ang income. All the other things, the change in environment, rise in price of related goods, population, change in taste and preferences yan eh. All of those will affect your demand curve. And so they could cause your demand curve to either shift to the left or to the right, depending on the direction of all the other determinants happen to move. Let's say change in environment. Let's say mas naging let's say nagkagera. Nasa Ukraine ka. Naggera. What will happen to the demand curve? Kasi may assumption doon ng peace, di ba? When you created that demand, when you estimated the aggregate demand curve, there was an assumption of peace. Now there's war. What will happen to the demand curve? Shift to the left or to the right? Answer?
Left.
To the left, sir.
To the left, exactly. Rise in price of other goods. Let's say the rise in price of substitutes. The rise in price of substitutes. Let's say this is I don't know, sapatos versus chinelas. Alright? Kung bumaba ang presyo ng chinelas, although they're not perfect substitutes kasi dahil may mga occasion na sapatos talaga isusuot. Wag yan, hindi magandang example. Let's say ano na lang, sine. Yung manonood ka ng action versus comedy. Kapag biglang lahat ng mga comedy films merong tax, libawa lang, no? Lahat ng comedy films may tax. Ibig sabihin tataas yung presyo ng mga comedy films. What will happen to the demand for action movies? Left or to the right?
Right po, sir.
Exactly. All right. Pagka-complement naman, halimbawa asukal, halimbawa ano naman, na ako maisip, tsaa at saka kalamansi. Naglalagay kasi ako ng kalamansi sa tsaa. Okay, so halimbawa, kapag tumaas ang presyo ng kalamansi, anong mangyayari sa demand for tea? Left or right?
Left po, sir.
Okay. Population, pag tumami ang tao, left or right?
Right po, sir.
Right, okay. Yun ang nangyayari sa Ukraine. Nangangamatay ang mga Ukrainians. That will shift the demand curve to the left. Alright. Change in taste. Ganun din. Change in taste as affected by different factors. Okay. All right. So what's the difference between a shift and a movement? Shift happens when at least one of the outside factors, which we call exogenous factors. So pag sinabing exogenous, ito na yung mga other determinants of the demand curve, rise in income. Exogenous yan kasi wala yan doon sa model. Ibig sabihin, they're assumed to be constant. So when those exogenous factors, those outside factors, when one of those changes, then the demand curve will shift either to the left or to the right, depending on the direction of the change. Movement along the demand curve is only when we're trying to put together or trying to relate price of the good and the quantity demanded. All right. So may difference yung sa pag sinabing change in demand versus change in the quantity of demand. Kasi pag change in demand, normally para lang wag magkalito, pag sinabing change in demand, it's the entire demand curve that shifts. Pag sinabi lang quantity demanded, it's just the quantity that's it's normal, it's just a movement along the line. All right. Okay. Now let's talk about, so we've talked about the demand and let's talk about the supply. So ito na yung second, kumbaga ito yung asawa ng konsepto na pinag-aaralan natin. So kung merong demand, who can be the husband or the wife depending on whatever. And then there you have the supply curve. Now, the supply curve shows the relationship between the market price and the amount of the good producers are willing to sell, ceteris paribus. So yung kung the demand curve is from the perspective of the consumer, who is one of the two agents that we're studying, then the supply curve is from the perspective of the supplier or the producer, the one that's going to sell the good. Okay. Now, unlike the demand curve, the supply curve is upward sloping. Okay, so balikan muna natin sandali ano ang pinaka dahilan sa inyong isip bakit upward sloping ang supply curve. Ang logic nun is that as the price goes up, producers are willing to sell more. Okay. Logical naman. Ibig sabihin, kasi kapag ka mas parang you want to take advantage of the higher price, diba? So kapag ka mas mataas ang presyo, you'd like to make as much revenue as possible. So you'd like to sell more of the good, more quantity of the good than before because the price is higher. Now, why? Because that will increase your revenue. That will provide you possibilities for higher profit. Okay, so recall that the basis of the demand, the basis of people's consumers, but that's projected in the demand curve, is based on the desire to increase their happiness. All right, so the desire to increase their happiness. Whereas as far as the supplier is concerned, the desire is to increase profit. Okay, so the higher the price, remember that producers create products at a cost. Ibig sabihin, when they create products, hindi yan libre. Bumibili sila ng inputs, bumibili sila ng babayad sila ng kuryente, etc. So meron silang cost. So meron silang minimum na price na tinatanggap. Alright, so ang tinatanggap nilang presyo, at the very least, is the one that will cover the cost. Now, anything higher than that cost is, of course, acceptable. The higher the price, the more enticed they are to supply more of the good. But at the very least, the price must cover the cost, all right, or at least part of the cost. Kasi the supplier would like, at the very least, to have his costs paid for. All right, so that's logical. That's why the demand curve is upward sloping, because the higher the price, the more possibility that the cost will be covered, and at the same time, a higher possibility of profit. Okay, so like in the demand curve, let's look at this table of information. This is a supply schedule. Hindi yan quantity demanded. This is quantity supplied. Sorry, mali na naman yung table. Sandali lang ha, correct natin yan. Hindi yan quantity demanded, yan ay quantity supplied. Ay nako, mali. Mali. Okay. Alright. So, ito yung schedule. No? So, kapag ka 5 pesos yung price ng good, quantity supplied is 18. Kapag 4 pesos, quantity supplied is 16, and so on and so forth. No? Right? So, plot natin ito. Alright? Katulad ng ginawa natin doon sa demand curve. No? So, kapag 5 pesos, titingnan nyo 5 pesos, ang supply niya is around 16. No? So, around here. And then dito yan is 16. Ay, sorry. Mali na naman ako. Around 16. Dito yan, 16. No? So, ganon. Tapos, kapag bumaba yung price, there's going to be less. Pababa ng pababa yung price. Pababa ng pababa yung quantity supplied. Hanggang sa, ay nako, mali na naman ako. Nainis. Yan. So now your supply curve is upward sloping. Now notice dito na meron siyang yung minimum price niya is, well, anything, pag 1 or below ang price, ayaw na niya mag-supply. Alright? Now, possible din naman na meron na nanggagaling sa origin yung supply. Possible din naman yan. Kapag kaganyan yung sitwasyon, may inventory. Medyo maano yun, pag-aaralan nyo yun sa 100.1. Pero possible din naman na nanggagaling dito. Not because it's willing to supply at whatever zero price. It's just that there's inventory excess from the previous production period. No? Kaya parang nanggagaling sa origin because that may not make sense to you. Parang zero na nga yung, hindi pala. Pagka dito pala zero, tama pa pala, consistent pa pala to. Meron kasing situation na willing siya to supply up to zero, pero kasi meron din naman siya supply curve na ganito. Willing siya to supply even at zero kasi itong portion na to is carry over from the previous production period. Alright, so may tatlong possibilities no, sa supply. This one, itong may minimum price. The second one, which is it's from the origin, no, so hanggang zero. Pag zero yung price, zero din yung supply. Ito naman, kahit hindi zero yung price, hindi na siya magsusupply anything lower than 1. Meron din naman na at zero price, maaari siyang mag-supply. Yan yung medyo complicated ito. No? Hindi natin yan pag-aaralan. Pero posible din yan. Ang sitwasyon dyan, merong inventaryo ng supply mula sa nakaraang production. Kaya willing silang ipamigay. Alright, okay. Alright, so given that, then we have this supply curve. So we're able to draw the supply curve using all the data that we had before. Okay. Alright, what are the factors that determine the supply curve? First is production cost, as I said. Main consideration of the supplier is that his or her cost must be covered by the price. So production cost, those are factors that will determine the supply curve, meaning the prices of inputs. And the technological advances, because technology will determine your cost. The better the technology you have, the lesser cost. So there's going to be better way of doing things, or more efficient ways of doing things, then your cost will be less than before. So other that can determine the supply curve. Price of other or alternative goods, meaning we assume that the supplier has other options when it comes to production or what to do with his money. Alright, so halimbawang let's say the producer, the supplier is producing, it's a bakery, no? So it's producing bread and cakes, halimbawa. If the demand for bread is higher as a result of if the demand for bread is higher and therefore there will be higher price for bread, then it makes sense for this bakery to concentrate or to reallocate some of its resources from the production of cakes to produce more bread, because there's more money to be made in bread. All right, so if that's the case, it's similar to the complement and substitute goods that we talked about, only this time it's in terms of what can bring more money for the producer, for this, in this situation, the baker. All right, so if the price of the alternative good that the producer can produce is higher, then it makes better sense, makes more sense for this firm, for this producer to concentrate in the production of the other good. Meaning, hindi naman completing going zero yung production of cake, but probably reallocate some of the resources to produce more bread because there's more money to be made. And meron pa rin naman demand for cakes. Kaya lang, there's more demand for bread. So some of the resources, some of the eggs, some of the flour could be reallocated from the production or the baking of cakes to making bread. Okay, what else could determine the supply curve? Government policies that could affect production costs, such as taxes, subsidies, etc. So there's a difference. If a tax reduces or increases the price of inputs, a tax there or taxes in general, is a disincentive for production, which is why we don't want to tax too much. Government should tax too much because it's a disincentive for production. But at the same time, government taxes producers for a variety of reasons. Let's say they're trying to shape behavior, or they're just trying to generate more revenues, which is not necessarily bad, because the government does need revenues if it wants to create yung development projects. Remember, equity and efficiency. So one of the ways that government can do that is by taxing production. Now, subsidies, on the other hand, will encourage production, because subsidies means that the cost of production of the producer is going to be less. Let's say sinubsidize niya yung presyo ng asukal. Ibig sabihin, imbis na ang presyo ng asukal sa world market is 100 pesos per kilo halimbawa. The government said, okay, sa subsidized ko, so babayaran ko yung 10 pesos, so 90 pesos na lang ang babayaran ng producer, ng baker. So therefore, that's a decline in cost. So therefore, your supply is going to be more because production is cheaper. International trade. This has to do. International trade affects aggregate supply. Individual supply is different, no? Katulad din sa demand curve. Kasi what happens when there's trade? There's going to be an inflow of goods. So the quantity that's available in the market, in the local market, is going to rise because you now have more of quantity of the goods from international sources. So katulad halimbawa ng bigas. Okay. So that's one. Special forces that might or might not be expected, such as wars, political issues, COVID, etc. So balikan natin yung Ukraine example. As a result of war, what would happen to the supply curve, for example, of something that they do, maybe clothing. Wars would reduce supply because there's just not going to be, it's not possible. But in the case of Ukraine, medyo extreme, kasi all production activities have stopped. But normally, if let's say it's a far-flung area, may mga, let's say, portions of Ukraine, may mga na hindi pa occupied by Russian forces, yung mga malalayong probinsya, malaki din naman yung population ng Ukraine at marami silang mga probinsya. Yung mga yon na hindi pa occupied by the Russians, those would still have economic activity, but probably their production process would stop kasi baka yung mga suppliers nila galing, halimbawa, some of their inputs come from Kyiv na ngayon ay occupied by Russia, then the supply of inputs declines as a result of war, then that will affect supply. They can't produce as much because there's limited amount of inputs for production. Okay? All right, so shifts in the supply curve, katulad din ng pinag-usapan natin kanina, sa demand, meron ding sa supply, meron ding shifts katulad ng sa demand. Now, ceteris paribus, remember na ceteris paribus din yung ating assumption sa supply. So dito, kapag any of these things, these are all determinants of supply, the supply curve, na technological change in input prices, etc. If any of these factors changes, then the supply curve is going to shift. Okay, drawing natin ulit para meron kayong point of reference. Oops. Alright. So, ceteris paribus ito, no? Ibig sabihin, all other things being held constant, what are the only two things that we allow to change? That would be price and quantity. So, it's only price versus quantity. And then all of the other things are being held equal or the same. So, ceteris paribus. Now, if any of these factors, any of the factors that I just mentioned changes, your entire supply curve is going to change. If it's only the price that changes, it's a movement along the supply curve. If any of these things changes, it's a shift either to upward or downward. Alright? So technological change, ando natin lahat clear. Okay. Technological change. What will happen? Let's say aliens come to arrive in the Philippines and then bring us this wonderful technology that makes things faster and production better. What will happen to your supply curve? Up or down?
Down po, sir.
Down. Okay, because now, let's say this is the price, no? Price, let's say this is 10 pesos. At 10 pesos, let's say may production siya ng, ang supply niya is 20. Now, kapag ka nagkaroon ng better technology, for the same 10 pesos, kaya niya mag-supply ng 30. Alright? So think of it that way, whether, when you're trying to picture what's going to happen to the supply curve, if any of these things changes. All right. So if for the same price, is there going to be more or less of supply of the quantity of the good? If it's more, then it's a movement down or to the right. And if it's going to be less, all right, let's say halimbawa naman, tumaas ang input prices. Shift to the left or to the right, or up or down?
Up
Left
po.
po, sir. Up po.
Up or left, all right? No, kasi ngayon for the same price na 10 pesos, this producer can only supply 15 kasi mas mahal yung input prices. All right? So this is now supply to. All right? So the shift is upwards or to the left. Pareho lang naman. Change in price of related goods. Clear na natin. Let's say nagmahal ang naging mas mahal yung bread over butter. Nagmahal ang bread over butter. As far as butter tuloy, cake. Nagmahal ang bread over cake, no? Bakery tong producer natin. Then your supply curve is going to shift to the left or to the right. Nagmahal ang, this is supply for cakes. Ngayon tumaas ang presyo ng bread. Ang presyo ng bread is the other good that this bakery produces. No? Bukod sa cakes, nagpo-produce din siya ng bread. Tumaas ang presyo ng bread. Anong gagawin nitong supplier? Produce more cakes or produce less cakes?
Produce more cakes po.
Tumaas ang presyo ng bread.
Less cakes.
Less cakes, sir.
Less cakes. So, kasi tumaas yung presyo ng bread, di ba? Enticement sa kanya yun. So, i-divert niya yung iba niyang ang kanyang mga inputs from producing cakes to producing bread. So mag-shift yan to the left as a result. No? So for the same price, it's going to produce less amount. Let's say 20 and dati 15. Okay. Change in government policies, taxes, tariffs, quotas, taxes. What will happen to you? Pagka nag-increase ng tax to the left or to the right ang shift ng supply curve? Pag tinaasan ng taxes sa production,
Sir, less
The
in
left
supply.
po.
Yes po.
Then the opposite is subsidy. No? Kapag subsidy naman, nagmumura yung production cost. Special circumstances, as mentioned earlier, war, calamities, let's say, etc. Those will affect your supply as well. Okay? All right. Oops. All right. So now, pagsasamahin natin silang dalawa, we now have an understanding of equilibrium of demand and supply. Ngayon, balik-aralan lang natin. Recall that the demand is the information on how much will be bought at each price level, and supply naman shows you the information on how much are available at each price level. Let's combine these two together in order to arrive at what we call equilibrium price and quantity. Now, ang ibig sabihin ng equilibrium, from the word itself, equilibrium, balance. Now, this equilibrium price and quantity is a stable point. This is at the point wherein demand is equal to supply. This is also what's known or referred to as the market price kasi this is where the market clears. Pag sinabing the market clears, ibig sabihin demand is equal to supply. There's a perfect balance. When the market clears, that's where the market price is. Okay, or the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so ngayon pinagsama natin yung demand curve natin. Demand curve is the blue line, supply curve is the red line. So we put them together, the two schedules, and then their intersection is what we call the equilibrium price and quantity. So P of E and Q of E. Okay, so graphically, equilibrium price and quantity, or mathematically, is the intersection of the two functions, the two equations, and the supply function and the demand function. Mathematically, or in terms of algebra, you can calculate the equilibrium price and quantity. Because there are two ways to determine the equilibrium price and quantity. Draw the graph, the two graphs, and then their intersection is the equilibrium price and quantity, or calculate. No? So you have this, you have the demand function, and then you have the supply function. Alam mong demand function to kasi negative yung kanyang slope. Yung B niya is negative. Alam mong supply function ito kasi positive siya. Okay? So ngayon, pagsamahin natin silang dalawa at sabi natin at equilibrium, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So ibig sabihin, itong dalawang ito are equal. Alright? So yan. Andyan yan. No, ito ay ito. Ito ay ito. Gulo na. Clear. Alright? This one. And this one is that one. At equilibrium, the price, the demand price and the supply price are equal, as well as the quantity supplied. So okay, so dito dahil equal at equilibrium, ito at saka ito will be the same. So you can now just call them as PS is equal to just P. Alright? Kasi equilibrium na yun. At equilibrium kasi price, the demand price and the supply price are the same. The quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are the same. They're equal. So pwede mo na ngayong isolve ito. Siguro naman hindi na kayo matatakot. Simpleng algebra lang ito. No? So kayang-kaya nyo na itong i-calculate. So you go through the motions and then you'll find that this is your resulting equation. No? And then ano lang natin, i-simplify yung equation. So this is now M, which represents this one. So yung BP plus HP mo, ginawa lang nating P times B plus H is now equal to M. Okay? So therefore, your equilibrium price is simply this one. Okay? Alright, so ngayon, na-solve na natin. Kaya nyo nang isolve ang equilibrium price and quantity. Okay? Alright. Any questions before we proceed to chapter 4? Remember, I can't see you, so hindi ko, kung nagta-type kayo ng questions sa chat box, hindi ko makikita. So, say it out loud. Meron ba kayong question? Wala? Okay, so simple lang naman yung dalawang konsepto. Ang pinaka-highlight nun is how to calculate the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, now let's start chapter 4. These are the beginning topics in microeconomics. So talagang ito micro na lang. Pag-uusapan na natin particularly dito ay mga topics under microeconomics. The other two are the previous chapters are more still general concepts, particularly chapter 1. Chapter 2 is starting to talk about behavior, but still behavior of both the individual as well as the aggregate. And then now Then chapter 3 is more detailed. No, now the interaction of your demand and supply. And now chapter 4 is really about specific topics in microeconomics. So what is microeconomics? It's the branch of economics that examines in detail the behavior of firms, consumers, and markets. All right. So in detail, mas detallado. This is in contrast to 100.1, which is macroeconomics, where it examines in detail the behavior of the aggregate economy. This, in microeconomics, we're talking about the typical firm, and the typical consumers that comprise your aggregate economy. All right. Siyempre, may mga nuances yan. Hindi naman pare-pareho lahat. Pero we're talking about here the typical firm, the typical consumers. All right. So in microeconomics, we examine the relationship between price and quantity demanded and produced. So tinitingnan natin dito how price and quantity could be affected. What would the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity be when all of these things that happen either to the demand or to the consumers and to the producers happen at the same time. All right. So we now have a basic framework to analyze behavior. So here in microeconomics, we examine the exogenous variables that will cause the demand or the supply or both functions to shift. Right? So masusundan nyo na ito ngayon kasi alam nyo na yung basics ng microeconomics, basics ng behavior ng individual agents. Okay? All right. Now, one of the basic concepts in understanding or determining the magnitude of a price change to a price change to equilibrium quantity is what we call elasticity. So I wrote here, now that you know the direction of relationship between price and quantity for both demand and supply, we now ask how strong is this relationship. So alam nyo na yung direction, so you have an idea of what goes on. Now this time we're going to measure the intensity of response. Kung tumaas ang price by, let's say, 10%, how much will quantity demanded decline and how much will supply change as a result? Okay, so ganon. What if there's a change in price? What is going to be the effect? What's the magnitude of change of response of either the consumer or the producer? Okay, so nabubulol na ako. This degree of relationship or the quantitative relationship between price and quantity is what we call elasticity. All right? So pag sinabing price elasticity, which is what we, clear. This refers to the effect of price on quantity, or you can simply say the response of quantity to price. Okay, we just refer to that as elasticity. Meron kasing tinatawag na income elasticity naman pero in most of the discussion we're going to do in this class, it's when we talk about elasticity, we refer to price elasticity unless I specifically say, we're talking about income elasticity. Okay, so elasticity is the next topic. Okay, now what is the concept of elasticity? Price elasticity of demand. Conceptually, it is not easy. It's not hard to understand. Elasticity is just the quantitative response of or the degree of response, in magnitude of response in terms of quantity demanded or supplied when the price changes. So it measures how much quantity, in this case, a price elasticity of demand. So we're only talking about demand. It measures how much quantity demanded will change in percent in response to a price change in percent. I must emphasize this kasi lagi nagkakamali ang estudyante. When we talk about elasticity, we're measuring percent changes. A 1% change in price resulting in how much percent change in quantity demanded. Hindi yan 1 peso change. Hindi 1 peso change, when price changes by 1 peso, how much quantity will change. Hindi, it's measured in percent. Because if you go by yung unit, it becomes confusing. Kasi 1 peso change would result in a decline of 5 kilos. Alright, that does not properly represent what is the impact of price change on quantity demanded. It is better, it is way better and much with more information to describe everything in terms of percent, which is why elasticity is expressed in percent. So formally, elasticity can be calculated using this formula. Demand elasticity, ED, is equal to a percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. All right? So, as a rule, hindi mahirap intindihin to ha, baka na naman may mataranta sa inyo. It's exactly what it is. Now, this is a percentage change. So let's say it's a 10% change in quantity of rice. All right, this is, let's say, in kilos. Ay, hindi pala kasi percentage eh. Isa pang over, let's say, 5% change in price of rice. That's another reason why we use percentage change. Kasi kapag pagka kinalculate mo to at it in terms of kilos, anong unit mo at the end? Let's say this is going to be 10 kilos decline, 10 kilos decline in quantity divided by 5 pesos. Hindi mo makakalculate ito kasi yung units mo magkaiba, kilos and pesos. So to eliminate that confusion, we use percentage. 10% change in demand quantity demanded over, let's say, 5% change in price of rice. Ganyan, that's how it's calculated. Okay? Now, as a rule of thumb, when there is a 1% change in price results in more than 1% change in quantity demanded, we say, or we define this demand to be elastic. Ibig sabihin kasi, yung very effective, malakas ang effect ng price sa quantity demanded. So it's elastic demand. All right? When a 1% change in price results in equal 1% change in quantity demanded, we refer to this as, less than 1% change in quantity demanded, the demand is inelastic. When the 1% change in price results in equal, the same 1% change in quantity demanded, the demand is called unitary elastic. Now, bakit importanteng malaman ito? Maraming gamit kasi ang elasticity. No? So, and I will explain that later. For now, ask your teaching fellow to play around with numbers later when you have your discussion class, and try to calculate elasticities using the formula that I just showed you. Okay, so this is an example. Hindi na ako mag-elaborate kasi straightforward dito. No? You have two prices, price 1 and price 2. So there's a change in price. You calculate the percentage change, you get the ratio, that's the elasticity of demand. All right, so when we calculate the percentage change in either the price or quantity, ayan, there is a confusion as to which of the two, the old or the new price should we use as the base. If the change is small, it doesn't matter whether you use, kasi di ba, price 1 and price 2, anong gagamitin mo as your base price? Price 1 or price 2? So, the new price or the old price? Kapag i-divide mo na yung, kasi kakalculate mo yung percentage change eh. Kapag the change in price is small, or the change in quantity is small, it doesn't matter. Kasi magiging almost the same yung sagot. But if the change is large, we suggest to use the average of the two to avoid ambiguity. All right, so this means that kapag malalaki yung change, your elasticity of demand can be calculated this way. If you use this formula, it's called arc elasticity. All right. Now, if you don't take the average yung sa denominator, no, kasi Q1 plus Q2 divided by 2, you take the average. This is arc elasticity formula, arc elasticity. It doesn't matter actually kasi what matters is that you'll be able to determine whether it's elastic or inelastic. Whether you use arc elasticity or point elasticity, which is the previous one that we used, versus point elasticity, it will yield the same answer, meaning not the same number, but the same conclusion, whether it's elastic or not, or inelastic. All right, it's 11 o'clock, so we have to end here. Next time, we're going to look at special cases of elasticity. No? So bigyan ko lang kayo ng preview. May mga demand curves that are vertical, completely vertical. Merong demand curves that are completely horizontal. And then, of course, you have the regular demand curves. No? Pero pag-uusapan na lang natin yan next time. We'll end here dito sa calculation ng arc elasticity, and we'll continue and finish chapter 4 next Tuesday. We'll begin chapter 5, finish chapter 5 by Thursday next week, and you're all set to take the exam Saturday after Thursday next week. Okay, thank you very much. It's 11 o'clock, so maraming salamat. Have a good weekend and have a good discussion class today. Sige, maraming salamat. End na natin ito.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sir.
Have fun.
Thank you po.
Alright, quickly lang, ano ba yung mga nakasa chat? What does A represent in the cube and what C is function? Yung si J dito. A represents the intercept, as I said. C represents the intercept. Ano intercept? Yun yung kapag price is 0, what is the quantity demanded or quantity supplied? Okay, kapag siguro, JD, are you still here? Wala na. Ha? JD, paalala mo sa akin to next Tuesday na para lang what do the intercepts mean? All right. What if due to war the government ends spending more but the regular people spend less? What will the demand curve shift? How will the demand curve shift? This is the individual demand curve, not the aggregate. Kasi yung we're only talking about not the individual consumer here, not the government. That is for Rosedin, Joseph. All right. You can ask this question again on Tuesday and I'll answer it. Okay?
Thank you po.
Okay, thank you. Bye.